Good evening, everyone, and welcome to this meeting of the Corporate Services, Climate Change and Scrutiny Management Committee. So welcome to all members, executive members, public speakers and officers. I haven't received any apologies for this evening's meeting. In terms of housekeeping, if any attendees need the toilets, they're just behind me through this door. Any members of the public who need to leave the meeting, please do so through the door on my left rather than through the door at the rear of the room. Next agenda item is declarations of interest. Could I ask any members to declare any interests they wish? Councillor Rowley.
Thank you, Chair. It's really just in the interest of transparency. I don't believe it's a pecuniary interest or any other kind of interest. Really, it's just to let you know that in terms of agenda item number 6, I am assisting one of my residents in a blue badge application who has gone through the process and is still going through the process, who is a sufferer of Parkinson's disease. So I have had a lot of discussions with Parkinson's UK. So it's just really just the transparency more than a declaration of interest.
Okay, thank you. That's noted. Councillor Eyre.
Again, for transparency, Chair, on agenda item 6, that my partner is a blue badge holder.
Thank you very much. Anybody else? Councillor Merritt.
Yes, not non-pecuniary in terms of item 5, my membership of York Environment Forum and York Climate Action Groups.
Okay, thank you very much. Okay, next agenda item are the minutes of the meeting held on 25th of September. Do any members have any matters of accuracy in the minutes that they would like to raise? Or are we happy to approve the minutes? Yes, thank you. Thank you very much. Before we move on to public participation, I'd just like to seek members' consent to slightly reorder the agenda by moving agenda item 5, which is the intermediate carbon reduction targets, to after the elections item, just so that we can have we can spend that last chunk of the meeting focusing on that paper, which is probably the most substantive discussion that we'll have this evening. So our members consent for us to take 4, 6 and 7, and then take agenda item 5. Councillor Villiers.
Unfortunately, I have to leave earlier because I've got to get children to Scouts. Okay. So I might not be here for agenda item 5. But okay, yeah, that's so. No, I don't know that I'm entirely essential to it. So I'm just saying that. Yeah, I
think it probably is quite important that you're here for that discussion. So it's not the end of the world. We can stick to the agenda as published. That's not a problem. Is Councillor Kent expected or not?
She said she was, but I don't know. She's not here, so yeah.
That's fine. We'll kind of crack on as per the published agenda. That's not a problem. Okay, so we now move on to public participation. We have 3 registered speakers today. The first is Flick Williams, who's joining us via Zoom and is speaking in relation to agenda item 6. Can you hear us, Flick?
Good evening.
Hello. Right, you have 3 minutes, so in your own time.
Elected members, having attended the meeting on Friday 29th of September to discuss the Blue Badge application process, I had no intention of speaking at this meeting this evening. I felt that meeting was a positive one and went away from it feeling that we were moving towards a position much more akin to co-production between this authority and those of us from the disabled community and the voluntary sector supporting disabled citizens. I genuinely felt we were not only listened to, but had been heard. Imagine my disappointment then when a point I made very clearly there and which was accepted at the time was not corrected and appears in the papers before you. I prefaced my point then, as I do now, with the recognition that despite it being the anniversary on Thursday since this council adopted the social model of disability, meaningful disability equality training for both officers and members has not yet been rolled out. Consequently, I'm not expecting a deeper level of understanding, but what I do think it is reasonable to expect is an avoidance of basic departures from it, especially where they are pointed out and an explanation given as to why they are problematic. Repeated use of the term suffering from aligns with the medical model of disability. It makes a medicalised value judgment of the lives of disabled people and reduces us to our diagnoses rather than seeing us as equal and valued members of the community. It paints us as other and lesser than non-disabled people. Yes, eligibility for a blue badge is based on our impairments or long-term health conditions, but we live with them. The social model regards impairment as personal, and it is not for others to express their feelings about them. There are many disabled people who give untold hours of their time to assisting this council, and I feel it is disrespectful to seemingly accept the points we make and then ignore them. To avoid repetition, the other feedback is covered by the speaker from YDRF, but there is one other point that I should like to emphasise. You must anticipate a rise in applications going forward as more people meet the eligibility criteria. We have an ageing population, knowing that the incidence of impairment rises with age, but we also remain in an ongoing mass disabling event. Statistically, the likelihood of getting long COVID rises with every single infection, regardless of vaccination status. We know the numbers of those whose mobility or vision is affected to the degree that they meet the eligibility threshold is both significant and rising. This, coupled with the also growing number of renewals applied for by people every 3 years, will place significant demand on both the service and the services of those who support individuals to make applications. Sadly, yet another challenge to resourcing faced by this authority, one which I very much hope you will recognise and plan for. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Flick Williams. So our next speaker is Gwen Swinburne, who is here in person. He'll be speaking on the general remit of the committee. You've got 3 minutes in your own time.
Thank you, Chair. 4 items. I have raised this in other places, but may I ask formally that you address the poor practice of officers denying all members full access to pink papers, whether they are committee members or not, and also that all members are able to remain for pink paper discussions. This is standard practice across well-run member-controlled councils. Second, it is essential in my view that you and the A&G committee have an urgent review of the draft constitution and officer member delegations for the combined authority. This will also have knock-ons for our own constitution and delegations. I asked North Yorkshire Management and they said it will go to the Joint Devolution Committee in January to be adopted. No plans for any CYC member input. This is concerning. How can it be that our statutory officers have done nothing to engage with you nor us on this? Thirdly, re-election matters. With the severe cutback in staffing and their overwork, may I ask that, as most councils do, instead of staff being used for most election duties, polling stations, postal votes and the count, that you start using citizens, bank tellers and so on. This will save many thousands of hours of lost working time as staff are paid both their salaries and their election fees. It would increase the productivity of the council with no loss to us. This would take a small initial effort and could provide a good income boost for citizens in the community. Finally, Chair, may I ask that you review the flag flying protocol at the Mansion House. Given York's dreadful history on massacring the Jews in the Clifford's Tower, I was staggered that leaders declined to fly the Israeli flag after the massacre of Jews by Hamas. For many months, we have had the Ukrainian flag flying interspersed with various vanity flags to suit. It's time the protocol was reviewed, in my view, to remove all vanity flags and limit to the Union flag and York. It is not right that we didn't raise the Israeli flag. It's not all right to do that, Chair. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Gwen? So our third and final speaker is Helen Jones, who will be speaking in relation to agenda item 6. Hello, Helen.
Hi.
So if you press the button in the middle of the speaker.
It's already on.
Yeah, you're on. So you've got 3
Oh,
minutes.
Sorry, can I just straighten
Yes.
myself up?
That's fine.
There we go.
So yeah, you got.
Oh, I was going to drop my mask.
That's okay.
I will start in a second. Thank
There you
you. I think that should be everything.
So in your own time, it's 3
Okay.
minutes. Thank you.
I'm speaking as chair of York Disability Rights Forum, but also on behalf of Older Citizens Advocacy York to offer our shared thoughts and experiences on the blue badge processes. We support the officer's recommendation of an in-depth review of the application, renewal and appeal processes. We have argued for some time that improvements are needed, and we're pleased to take part in a meeting with officers who listen carefully to our feedback. We now hope to see positive action as a result. Our shared experiences are that the existing processes use lengthy forms that are difficult to either understand or complete and can be unnecessarily repetitive. Much of the information required could be extracted by the council from a patient summary form or what the NHS calls a summary care record. This is freely obtainable from GPs, but this is not currently explained to applicants. If more support was available, for example, a dedicated helpline or one-to-one support provided by skilled staff, we believe more applications would be successful, fewer would need to go to appeal. And those that do go to appeal, the report shows that most are successful, suggesting there are flaws in the existing system. It is also of great concern that less than 6% of those turned down on their original application go on to appeal, meaning over 94% drop out for reasons at this point we don't know, but my own experience, quite possibly because they have been broken by the experience of applying. An in-depth review would help understand why this is, especially as we suspect many would be eligible. For anyone applying to renew their badge, York currently asks for information which is already available on their system instead of asking for updates, as happens in other areas. No practical assistance is provided with updating photos, and addressing these areas would save time and energy for applicants and the council. Officers have suggested there is a risk to the council if the number of applications rises. However, there's a risk to the council if it fails to maintain the capacity of the team to deal with what, as Flick referred to, will inevitably be a rise in the number of disabled residents in York. Being awarded a blue badge is of enormous benefit in many ways and may in fact reduce demand for other services, council services, health services. We should not deter applicants. Finally, we would like to applaud the council for providing paper copies of the application and strongly recommend this continues. The recent consultation on reopening the city centre, for example, received many responses from blue badge holders, reinforcing the importance of non-digital communication.
Thank you very much, Helen, and thanks to our other speakers, and I'm sure members will bear those comments in mind when we come to discuss those agenda items. Okay, so we'll move on to agenda item 4, which is Finance and Performance Monitor 1. So if I can ask Debbie Mitchell and Ian Cunningham to join us. So if I can ask Debbie and Ian to introduce themselves, please, and then to give us a brief overview of the report before we open it up to members' questions and comments. Thank you.
Yep. Hello, everybody. My name is Debbie Mitchell. I'm the Council's Chief Finance Officer. If I do a brief introduction and then hand over to Ian. So this is the first report of the year covering the latest finance and performance information. And it just follows the main monitoring report that was presented to Executive last month. The report outlines forecast overspend of some £11 million, which is predominantly due to the continued pressures being seen across social care. In common, I think, with most other councils in the country, we're seeing an increase in both the demand for services and in an increase in the complexity of those cases. And I'm sure members here are all aware that that's, of course, a national issue and not something that's unique to York. Equally, we'll all be aware that this forecast overspend is not a new issue to York, as reports to executive and various scrutiny committees over recent years has highlighted how we've had these recurring pressures, but the mitigations that we've managed to find have predominantly been one-off. The report outlines some of the actions that were agreed by executive last month, as well as identifying some areas for further action, some further work that's been undertaken. And it's my view that these actions are essential to ensure the continued financial stability and resilience of the council. Members also be aware that many other councils across the country are struggling to balance their budgets. And so again, these financial challenges that we're seeing are not unique to York, but taking that action now will absolutely prevent us being in a similarly difficult situation in future. So I'll hand over to Ian.
Hi all, it's Ian Cunningham, Head of Business Intelligence. As Debbie said, this is the performance information that's already been to executive. Some of the similar indicators that you normally see. We're between performance frameworks at the moment. So at the Q1 executive, a new basket of indicators was agreed for the next political cycle. So some of those indicators will come to corporate scrutiny going forward. Out of the performance indicators, there's some positive performance in sickness patterns, a continued reduction and closer back to the national benchmarks for the public sector average. And there's some good performance there around complaints and in time responses to FOIs. So some positive signs in the information.
Thank you very much. Admirably brief. So as has been mentioned, this is a subset of information that's previously been to executive. So what I would like to suggest to members is we focus on some of the high level information in line with our overview responsibilities, and in relation to the service areas that are specific to this committee covered in paragraphs 19 to 26. So I'll open it up to members for any questions or comments they'd like to make to Ian and Debbie. Councillor Eyre.
Yeah, thank you, Chair. This is quite a long report, so it's quite old in terms of that one. But on page 9, paragraph 10, the third bullet point, there was the intention, this was from Q1, to identify alternative funding sources for the remaining one-off funding of 650,000. We're now in Q3. How much of that 650,000 has been found alternative funding?
I don't know off the top of my head, Councillor. I'll have to go away and find that out. We are in Q3, but remember, it is only a month since the executive made this decision. So it's the 14th of September that we took this main report to executive. So
has any of the 650?
I don't know off the top of my head. I'd have to go away and have a look.
Okay, so if you can share with the committee any information that is available, that'd be helpful. Thank you. Councillor Rowley.
Thank you, Chair. My question is really about West offices and the capacity to increase lettings. What I have noticed as a member is that in the last 4 years, there's far less the City of York Council and far more other bodies in the building, and very in the minority now, I think. Are we at capacity in terms of potential lets for West offices, or is there still room for us to look at increasing revenue?
Again, sorry, I'm probably not the best person to answer that question. My understanding is that we have let everything out except the first floor, which is this floor, which is where council staff operate. And this is the only floor that we have access to. So when we're booking desks, we can only book on this floor. Everything else is, to my knowledge, let. I don't think Ian knows anymore. Yeah. So we are fully let.
Okay. Thank you. Councillor Waller.
Thank you. It's just in relation to the vacancy management. How is that being handled in terms of those posts that are being filled when they become vacant, because they are even more critical than than most posts, and those that are being kept vacant for this purpose?
So that decision making is being handled by the individual directors and corporate directors across the council. But broadly speaking, if a post becomes vacant, that will go through the management chain for discussion to identify, does the post need to be filled straight away? Can it be held temporarily vacant? Is it needed at all? Can the workload be done in a different way? Those kind of conversations. Obviously, there are some posts where there's an exception, so essential health and safety, essential frontline service like social workers, waste loaders, those kind of areas where cover is required. Anything that's income generating would go forward, and then anything else will be reviewed by directors and corporate directors for a decision, and ultimately everything coming through myself and the head of HR for a final decision.
Yep.
So a follow-up. Has there been discussions with unions in terms of those posts that may be deemed not needed?
Well, we have had discussions with the unions on the broadest level about the process and what we're doing. I've not been involved in discussions with them about individual posts, but again, I can take that away and check. So we do have regular meetings with the unions, both at a corporate level and at a directorate level. I'm not part of those directorate level meetings. Certainly the corporate services and customers and community ones that I am part of, we do have a conversation about those posts, but I need to check that that is what happens everywhere else.
Thank you. Councillor Taylor.
Thank you, Chair. I just wondered if, this is for you, Debbie, if you think there's any more scope for more, if you like, regular and, for want of a better word, honest corporate communications about the situation we find ourselves in, and if you might want to talk around that. Obviously, a council will have to word things differently to how a political party might, but I'm really, and I have been for years, I've been quite concerned about the gap in general public awareness of local government funding and just how much of a mess it's in. Might you have anything to say on that? I know it's not directly your role, but you're one of the.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Yeah, we have been having ongoing conversations with head of comms around how we can improve our messaging and having, like you say, kind of an honest conversation with residents, with staff, with partners, to just outline the reality of the financial situation. I think in a strange way, the situation that's happening at other councils like Birmingham has helped actually people's understanding a little bit more, because it's been such a high profile news story, hasn't it, about the state of funding in local government. So a lot of the problems that we're facing are national issues that essentially require a national solution. So there's limited things that we can, well, there's a lot that we can do, don't get me wrong, but you know, a lot of it does require that national solution. So yeah, we are looking at as part of the budget setting process for next year, certainly about how we communicate with people around what things actually cost, what our responsibilities are, what sort of services we provide. So yeah.
Councillor Taylor.
Thank you for that. And then just to sort of further on that with quite a specific thing in terms of communicating how much things cost to people. Something that I've always been interested in is, for want of a better phrase, the true cost of things that we do. And I wonder if within, and I'm sure it does take place, but I'd like to have a better understanding of it. Along with all the sort of measures that have been outlined, how do we go about trying to improve sort of efficiency between areas? So there might be a piece of casework that bounces around emails a painful amount of times between different teams. There's cost attached to that, which might not necessarily be seen in an obvious budget line, or problems in the city that won't be fully resolved until they've been touched by 4 different parts of the council. So an example might be, ward colleagues have seen this, people dump bin bags in an alleyway. The waste collection team don't collect it because it's not been presented properly. They put a sticker on the bags to say we're not collecting it because it's not been presented properly. But that doesn't then automatically go to the fly tipping team So someone else has to then tell fly tipping or NEOs that there's possible fly tipping in an alleyway. They'll then come down and inspect the bin bags. And then street cleansing have to come by to remove it. And that takes a lot of time as well. And there's probably a better way of doing that. It might be a bit brutal, but
Yeah, no, you're absolutely right that it's difficult, as you say, for us to articulate and calculate that cost, but yeah, we try and get across to our managers and staff all the time how important it is to get it right first time, because if we don't get it right first time, then that is where those costs start to accumulate. So if you're in manufacturing, that's kind of, well rehearsed stuff, isn't it, about doing it once and doing it right. It is a bit more difficult when you're dealing with people, because they don't behave in the same way that machines do, I guess. So it does get slightly more complicated, doesn't it? Yeah. So yeah, no, but yeah, you're absolutely right. We don't routinely, unless Ian tells me otherwise, we don't routinely capture that cost of failure, if you like, of not getting it right first time. But certainly one of the areas that we're always looking at is how we can improve efficiency and how we can work better across the council. So that is certainly something we can take a look at.
Okay, thank you. Councillor Burton.
Just a simple question, really. Given that the situation is not just in York, that finances are tight, are councils throughout the country working together to ask central government for more funds? I know possibly the answer is they won't get them, but it again raising awareness amongst people of how tight things are and how difficult it is to manage on what we do have.
Yes, absolutely. So we have previously been part of a group called the F20, which are the 20 lowest funded councils in the country, that did some lobbying. But the Local Government Association are also preparing some communications. So the Chancellor's autumn statement, I think, is due on the 22nd of November. So I think the LJ are busy preparing a submission to send to DLUC about the funding in local government. I know various children's associations have also, following the Josh McAllister review, have made some submissions, and we've also I've seen some going around locally from Yorkshire and Humber councils as well. So there is a lot of lobbying being done. As ever, I mean, I guess we've all been there, haven't we, and seen the effect. But I would imagine that the noise at central government level is probably quite overwhelming from local government at the moment. So, yeah.
Thank you. Councillor Eyre.
Thank you, Chair. I have a question for Ian or Bryn. On page 15, the FOI responses in time. Can I have lengthy conversations about the value otherwise of KPIs and directions of travel, etc. This is something that for a long period of time has not raised any red flags. And then we have a situation where we have the ICO intervening and then the report coming to audit governance telling us that there's a massive failure in our FOI responses. How has this system not worked in terms of both executive members and scrutiny overseeing that? And not at any point has this KPI ever suggested that anything is wrong, which would suggest something's not right about that KPI, that it didn't flag that problem up any sooner?
Who'd like to have a go at that?
I'll take it first. Sure, Ben will add if he wants to. We have lots of KPIs, obviously, for that whole FOI section. And you're right, there are some bits that may have slipped through there. Actually, monitoring or keeping an eye on no outcome FOIs has been a challenge. I don't think it's quite right to say that as an organisation we've always got FOIs right. I mean, keeping an eye actually on the in-time performance has been really important to us. I mean, I can remember some times where we've been in this committee and we've talked about performance being around the 50 or 60% mark. So making sure that we're pushing it up as best as we can there. Out the back of the challenge that we've had back from the ICO, we've looked at a number of actions across the organisation, and I've certainly not cited on them all, but I have looked at the actions around performance. So we've built a new suite of performance metrics that comes out of our complaint system and our SARs and FOI system, so that we can monitor them more effectively, get them to directorate management teams, make sure that we can react quicker as an organisation. So I think it's fair to say that is a performance metric we could have looked at more and could have built previously, but going forward it's something I think is more available to the organisation internally to keep an eye on it.
Okay. Thank you. Do you want to add anything, Bryn?
I think what you've got is a KPI which is measuring the positive. What it's not set up to do is reflect the negative. And if you think about the number of freedom of information requests we get in any given 12-month period. So if you're talking here about a period between April 2021, I believe it is, sorry, 22, no, and now you're looking at probably somewhere around 4,500 FOI requests. And of that, we have 261 that we had failed to respond to. So in statistical terms, it's not an enormous number, but that's not to in any way seek to minimize the impact on individuals of not receiving the information they've requested. That should have been done. It wasn't, and it's being remedied. So I suppose it's a question of whether the KPIs can possibly achieve what they need to, whether you have a KPI for number not sent, which in theory should always be 0. I think the point is it's the KPIs that are there are trying to measure something different to what's arisen.
Okay. And that, yeah, obviously, as we receive future versions of this report, it may be an issue that we want to keep an eye on. Any other questions from members? No? Thank you very much. Thank you, Debbie and Ian. I think it is important that these these reports do come to scrutiny committees, sort of suitably tailored for each committee, so we have an overview of performance and the financial situation and can identify any issues that we want to do further work on. So thank you to officers for preparing that. Okay, so we'll now move on as per the published agenda to agenda item 5, intermediate carbon reduction targets. So if I ask officers to come to the table, just by way of context, this committee now has climate change within its remit. This is the really the first time we've had the opportunity to to discuss climate change related matters, and it's something that the Vice Chair and I are concerned to make sure isn't overlooked as we populate the agendas going forward. So this is coming to us now on the back of a resolution that was passed by full council in July, which stated that the executive develops a process that demonstrates clear commitment to a strengthened York 10-year climate strategy by exploring a series of intermediate carbon reduction targets following exploration of the topic at this committee. So that's what we're here to do. And paragraph 35 of the report sets out some recommendations for discussion. So it's a relatively sort of clean slate in terms of feeding back any comments that we want on the basis of what's in the report that will hopefully inform the work that executive will be doing. So if I ask Claire and Sean to introduce yourselves, please, and then give us a brief overview of the report. Thank you.
Shall I start and then hand over? I'll start and then hand over to Sean. So hello, I'm Claire Fole. I'm Assistant Director of Policy and Strategy here at the Council, and I've got Chief Officer responsibility for climate change as well. So thank you for inviting us here today. We've brought to you a report which shows how the Council is monitoring progress to reach our target of net zero by 2030, following the carbon reduction route map, which is set out in the Climate Change Strategy 2022 to 2032. Which was published and approved by Council in December 22. The report presents different approaches currently used to monitor progress. It shares current and optional metrics and considers whether and how to set intermediate targets as requested. There's 3 things to really note in the report, or that I'd like to draw your attention to, and I'm sure Sean will pull out some more. First of all, the Council accounts for only 4% of total citywide area emissions. And that the Council achieving net zero by 2030 is, of course, a different set of challenges for the city to meet net zero by 2030. That we currently have and are focused on scope 1 or 2 emissions, but we can and are starting to explore scope 3 where it's practical to do so. And Sean will, of course, explain the difference if you need us to. And then the actual route map itself is following a science-based approach, which defines best practice, and by doing so brings with it certain limitations. For example, it defines near-term targets covering a minimum of 5 years when we are actually less than 7 years away from our challenge of meeting net zero by 2030. Any recommendations that you put to us today will be considering and then taken to an executive decision-making session in November, where we hope to present the carbon emissions for both the city and the council for the previous year, or the year we've just had. So we're really keen to hear everything you've got to say so that you can feed into that process. Thank you. I'll hand over to Sean.
Thanks, Claire. Hi, Chair. I'm Sean Gibbons, Head of Carbon Reduction. Thank you for giving the introduction on the council motion. This report on intermediate carbon reduction targets is set against the background of the climate emergency declaration and the ambition for York to be net zero carbon by 2030. I'm just going to take a moment to provide some background on establishing carbon reduction targets using the Science Based Targets Initiative, or SBTI's guidance. The detail of that is provided in Annex 1 of your report back. And also use this opportunity to provide some definitions for commonly used terms, just so that everyone is on the same level of understanding. The first one is the difference between net zero and carbon neutral. The wording in the original full council motion to declare a climate emergency was that York would be carbon neutral. These terms are often used interchangeably, but when it comes to setting a target, there is an important difference. So carbon neutral is all about balancing the amount of emissions that we generate with the amount of emissions that are absorbed or are removed from the atmosphere. And there is no minimum requirement to reduce emissions in a carbon neutral scenario. So as long as you're removing the same amount of emissions from the atmosphere that you're producing, you are deemed to be carbon neutral. Net zero is slightly different. It's a bit more stringent in terms of a target. There is a minimum requirement for emissions reduction associated with net zero. That's an 80% emissions reduction, and those remaining emissions can need to be removed from the atmosphere to achieve that net zero target. Net zero is more challenging than carbon neutral to achieve for an organisation or an area, and it's net zero is what we adopted as our target within the climate change strategy. The next thing is around the boundaries. There's two boundaries in discussion within this paper. It's the organisational boundary, which is often what's under your financial control as an organisation, and then the area-wide boundary. That's emissions that occur within our local authority boundary in this instance. The next is around the scopes. Claire mentioned earlier, scope 1, scope 2 and scope 3. Scope 1 are emissions that you're directly responsible for as an organisation or an area. It's the burning of fossil fuels within your defined boundary. Scope 3 are the emissions associated with the energy that you use within the boundary, but that energy might have been generated elsewhere. It's often associated with electricity consumption. And scope 3 are associated with your consumption emissions, so emissions that occurred outside of the boundary but are associated with the products, services that you're using within your organisation or within your boundary. Next is the term disclosure. This is public disclosure of reports and emissions. We do this every year as City of York Council, and we disclose to CDP, formerly Carbon Disclosure Project, and also the Global Covenant of Mayors, both internationally recognised organisations for disclosing carbon emissions. The next one is the difference between offsetting and insetting. Offsetting is the removal of carbon emissions from the atmosphere. That's what is required to achieve net zero if you're not at absolute zero emissions. And insetting is the same process, but it's done within the boundary either of your organisation or local authority. So an example of an insetting project is the delivery of York Community Woodland within the local authority boundary that will use it. It's a nature-based approach to absorbing carbon. And finally, the timelines that are involved here. So as Claire said, Science-Based Targets Initiative define a near-term target as anything between 5 and 10 years, and all targets need to be consistent with a net zero ambition by 2050 at the latest. So that's the approach that we've taken. If we start by looking at organisational intermediate carbon reduction targets, for the latest reporting year, total emissions for City of York Council were 4,706 tonnes of carbon dioxide equivalent. And this comprises data from the electricity usage of our buildings, the electricity usage from street lighting, gas usage within our buildings, water consumption within our own premises, waste produced by our corporate commercial activity, not household business waste, the activity of our council fleet and business travel. Based on the currently available data, achieving net zero for our organisational emissions by 2030 would require a 10% annual reduction in those emissions. That would mean that only 20% of our emissions would remain by 2030 from a 2021-22 baseline, and the remainder of those would need to be offset or inset to achieve that net zero ambition. I would say, though, that we continue to increase the data sources used for calculating organisational emissions. This year, for the first time, we will be able to include some of our Scope 3 emissions, and they relate to our building services and maintenance contracts. And we now have access to school energy data for the first time as well, so that will be incorporated when we report on that later this year. Whilst the increase in data availability improves the accuracy of reporting, it does make year-on-year comparisons more difficult, and it can create challenges when we're setting intermediate carbon reduction targets. Of course, we can set intermediate targets that aren't aligned with the SBTi guidance, but these wouldn't be verifiable against our 2030 ambition. Alternatively, indicators could be used as a proxy for progress towards our net zero ambition. Examples of these are provided in the climate change scorecard, which is Annex 2 of your papers. Moving to the area-wide emissions, these are derived from within the local authority boundary of York, and they've been calculated, using the tool Setting City Area Targets and Trajectories for Emissions Reduction, commonly abbreviated to SCATTER, the acronym SCATTER. For the latest reporting year, area-wide emissions for York, that's those covering Scope 1 and Scope 2, were 912 kilotons of carbon dioxide equivalent. And the York Climate Change Strategy establishes an area-wide science-based emissions reduction pathway for York, which would require a 13% annual reduction. But it is important to acknowledge that a linear year-on-year emissions reduction is unlikely to be achieved in practice. Variations in how quickly technology adapts, uptake, capacity, funding mean that reductions don't always occur on that linear basis every year. The report produced by University of Leeds in 2021, provided as Annex 3 in your report, suggests an area-wide science-based target of a 65% reduction in emissions by 2025. And that uses a baseline year of 2000. If we do use this as an intermediate target, that would require emissions to fall to 720,000 tonnes of CO2 equivalent by 2025. Another slight caveat is that the data that we use to establish this target is the same used by the SCATTER tool, so direct comparison is possible. But there is often a time delay as to when the SCATTER data is made available. This can be, currently it's around 2 years, so evaluation against 2025 target would only be possible in 2027. We're obviously getting very close to our 2030 net zero target then. But this would meet the requirements for science-based targets under the SBTi guidance. As with organisational emissions, alternative metrics for indicating progress have been proposed, and these are also included within the draft climate change scorecard in Annex 2. This report is presented for discussion amongst Scrutiny ahead of an options paper which will be prepared for the executive.
Thank you, Claire, and thank you, Sean. That's a lot of science for scrutiny, but it's important science. I'll start with a quick question just for my benefit. So the report talks about paragraphs 37 and 39, the scorecard and the reduction pathway. To what extent, can you just explain in a bit more detail what the purposes of those two items are in terms of showing us what the destination is?
Yeah, so the emissions reduction pathway is included within the York Climate Change Strategy, and that shows a year-on-year progress towards that science-based target of net zero by 2030. Actually goes a little bit beyond 2030. I think it goes out to 2050, and that shows the potential emissions reduction. Well, it shows three things. It shows a business as usual emissions reduction if we as a city and as a council were to do nothing and just relied on the continued decarbonisation of the electricity grid. It also shows the potential emissions reduction if we were to do all of the actions that are currently available to us as a local authority and a city within the constraints of finance, of consumer acceptance, of supply chain availability. And it also provides an emissions reduction pathway that is consistent with the Science-Based Targets Initiative's guidance of limiting global warming to below 1.5 degrees C. So three targets there. The scorecard has been produced recognising that tracking year-on-year carbon, the emissions reduction every year is really challenging. Data availability, the time lag associated with that. So rather than focus purely on carbon emissions every year, we've created a number of indicators to track output performance rather than be driven by the outcome of net zero. So these things, this includes things like progress towards decarbonisation of our fleet, progress towards decarbonisation of our asset portfolio, amongst other indicators.
Okay, no, thank you. That was worth clarifying some of the things that we're talking about. So, members, you are invited to explore this issue as best we are able to inform the work that will be done. Councillor Healy.
Thank you, Chair. Can I just confirm that the reason we're having this agenda item is to satisfy the question that was, or the challenge that was put to us by full council as stated in policy basis 4? And isn't to note the report?
We're able to note the report and comment on it. That's the invitation.
Okay, so the outcome of this meeting is to satisfy this statement that came from full council, because that doesn't seem to be what recommendations and reasons in point 7 don't seem to take note of that at all.
So there's a Scrutiny invited to comment on the content of this report, considering the challenges. Yes, I suppose you could argue paragraph 7 could have repeated what it says earlier in terms of we're invited to explore the issues raised in the report and comment with a view to informing the work that was mentioned in the full council motion. So, as I say, it's a relatively clean slate. You can explore to your heart's content. Yes, Councillor Widdowson.
If you actually read what's on 4, what it's saying is that we have to demonstrate a clear commitment to strengthen the intermediate targets, not explore it all. So my take on it was that's what the job around the table tonight was. It wasn't to explore it or to discuss it. It was to make sure that whatever measures for the intermediate carbon reduction targets, that they were actually agreed to be put forward to the exec, or have I misunderstood?
So the full council resolved that the executive will develop a process that demonstrates clear commitment to strengthen 10-year climate change strategy by exploring a series of intermediate carbon reduction targets following exploration. So it is what the discussion is, what we make of it. in terms of you can interpret it how you wish and comment on any aspects of what's in the report. Councillor Merritt.
Not quite on the topic, the wider topic that has been flagged. My understanding is that scope 3 emissions are quite a substantial proportion of the total. Obviously, the council's existing climate change strategy is focused on 1 and 2. But clearly emitting 3 is a significant emission. So very much welcome the fact that you've managed to nail down the building maintenance. What I'd perhaps just like to explore is the programme for trying to get the full grip on the full range of scope 3 emissions. And obviously the first step is having the information. Obviously, a lot of other businesses and companies are also looking at trying to reduce their carbon emissions. And I know my own company where I work is certainly doing that. So there must be an increasing amount of information out there. There is the GHG greenhouse gas protocol, which in fact gives a framework for doing that. Are we requiring all our suppliers to use and report those GHG emissions to us currently? And do we have, or if not, do we have a timetable for in effect rolling that out as all contracts come up for renewal or when we go out to new suppliers? Because obviously that's the, I suppose, base one in terms of moving towards effectively tackling scope 3 emissions.
Sean, do you want to have a go at that?
Yeah, recording scope 3 emissions for council contract suppliers, providers is not currently a requirement, but we are working towards increasing the availability of scope 3 data. We are working with our procurement team to make sure that we're asking the right questions throughout that process, so that anyone that's working with the council, for the council, understands the source of emissions associated with that contract that they're delivering, both scope 1, scope 2 and scope 1, scope 2 and scope 3. So we should be increasing the availability of data that we have available to us. And often it is being driven by the suppliers and providers themselves as well, who have a much better understanding of the embodied carbon within the products and services that they're providing. So it is increasing, but we don't have a timetable for it.
John, microphone. So.
Well, what are the practical constraints on that, and what do you think might be a realistic timescale for doing that?
Practical constraints, I'm not sure. I'd have to probably go and speak with our procurement team about what we can do, and similarly with the timeline. We are in the process of updating our procurement process around sustainability, so we do have an opportunity to include that. But yeah, I'll go away and speak with procurement and come back to you, Councillor.
Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Widdowson.
Just building on scope 3, from your experience and expertise in this area, how accurate do you think the scope 3 emissions reporting will be, and how much resource do you think it will take to get that information that we are going to be measured against, because it's now within the climate strategy?
Scope 3 emissions notoriously challenging to calculate and get access to. As Councillor Merritt says, there is increasing guidance available for doing that, which supports the process, but we would be pushing that requirement onto our suppliers and providers of those contracts. That may or may not come with an additional time requirement on their behalf, which may or may not come with a commensurate increase in cost on their behalf. I don't know if that would be the case or not, but it would likely be more work.
Thank you. Councillor Eyre.
Thank you, Chair. Page 21, there's nothing I love more than a black and white graph. It really makes life nice and easy to think of, but what I'm gathering from the slightly medium grey of that pie chart, obviously significantly over a third of total emissions coming from CYC buildings. Power 17, I was surprised that we were at 28 corporate buildings. I couldn't begin to think what the 28 different corporate buildings are, but I suppose the question I was getting to is, what is that significant capital cost? And nothing will be achieved without actually doing that. So is there an intention to have a target that sees that 70% reduction in emissions from those 28 buildings in the target? And then what would the capital expenditure be for that particular target? And which sites is it likely to be?
Yeah, so within those 28 sites, there is 21 schools included within those. There's 7 corporate sites, which also include a couple of leisure centres in there as well. And they relate to the work that we did with low carbon skills funding to produce decarbonisation plans for all of those sites. So we have costed the measures that would be required to achieve that emissions reduction saving. As yet, there is no firm plan to carry out those measures. There is no funding available to deliver those measures, but we are looking at the public sector decarbonisation scheme to access additional capital funding to carry out that work.
So how do you achieve the 80% reduction when a third of all of those emissions aren't going to be, we aren't going to do anything?
Can I just add, yeah, just to add to a different, there's 2 funding pots. There's the public sector decarbonisation scheme, which we have to bid for funding based on our public sector decarbonisation plans. And then in tandem, we have had net zero funding opportunity from the Mayor Combined Authority. Now that funding pot has closed, but we anticipate more funding from the Mayor Combined Authority as and when they get established and move forward. But it's not within the realms of council revenue funding or capital funding to decarbonise our buildings. Unfortunately, we'll have to seek alternative and external funding to support us, as will other local authorities. It's not just unique to us.
So what is that capital cost then altogether for the 28?
I do have that, but I don't have it with me, so I can come back to you.
Okay, thanks.
Yeah, thank you. Councillor Healy.
Thank you, Chair. Firstly, I'd just like to say Annex C is probably the best report I've seen since I've come back as a councillor. It's very good. It's got numbers in it. It's got cost benefits. It's a good report. So firstly on this was done in 2021. Is there any plans to regularly refresh it with, well, I don't know, costs should be going, well, probably down as well as up, to take account of hopefully we'll be emitting less carbon ourselves and across the city?
There is currently no plans to refresh the report.
Okay.
Okay.
Can someone note that might be a good idea to put in the recommendations?
You could go for it. Okay. Councillor Widdowson.
Just going back to the funding point that Nigel raised, Councillor Eyre raised. I know, Sean, that your team have been extremely successful in bidding for monies or for funding. Could you just paint a picture as to how many how many bids you've put forward, roughly how much money you've got, and roughly how much more we would require? Just in broad terms, it doesn't need to be, within $1 million or so.
Within $1 million.
No, because you've been extremely successful in bidding for them, but I know that there's a significant shortfall, and it's just paint that picture for us.
Yeah, gosh, I'm trying to think. We have been successful in applications to the Low Carbon Skills Fund, as mentioned before, which has funded the feasibility work for 28 of our buildings. And we have received additional funding to do library sites and a couple of other sites around the city as well. I think in total that feasibility work and the funding associated with that was around £1 million in total. We have secured funding for other projects as well, including the York Community Woodland. Off the top of my head, I'm struggling to think of other instances as well, but I think there's been about a 3-to-1 generation of grant funding income compared with expenditure on our team.
Can I?
Sorry, Claire, do you want
Just to add to that, we haven't yet got the data actually approved, but we know we're hoping, fingers crossed, we'll get somewhere with the net zero funding, which will be announced end of November. Possibly. So the net zero fund from the Mayor Combined Authority, we're expecting positive news from them. We're waiting to hear from Innovate UK about a substantial funding for a retrofit programme, which again, we'll hope to hear from early November. So Councillor Whittington is absolutely right. Sean's team are constantly applying for and being successful in bidding for different funding, covering a huge range of different projects, all of to do with carbon reduction. And so last year, I'm sorry, I haven't got the figures for this year, but last year we worked the cost of his team versus the amount he brought in was roughly £4.50 to £1. So for every pound we spent on the team, we got £4.50 in, which doesn't seem too bad for me.
follow up?
I know your team are really successful in that. That wasn't quite what I was trying. That wasn't what I was trying to get to. I've got no qualms at all about, you know, how successful and how efficient your area is. My concern is that we have to keep bidding for the monies, and from my understanding of the carbon reduction allocation, whatever we want to call it, from the mayoral fund and from the Innovate UK fund and everything else, we get maximum 20% of what is required to do all of the different activities we want to do. Is my feeling on that, because it's only from, you know, from trying to keep numbers in your head, we are 80% short. Going back to Councillor Ayres' point, we're roughly 80%-ish short on the funding that we require to do the first steps in what you're talking about, having done the feasibility. That was more where I was trying to get to, Sean.
Yes, that's true. I'm not entirely sure on the percentages, but it's true to say that the vast majority, if not all of those funding sources that have been mentioned, come with a match funding requirement. They don't fund 100% of the works, and a lot of the measures that are identified within the decarbonisation plans would not be entirely eligible under many of those funding streams. That's why I think the Mayoral Combined Authorities Net Zero Fund was of particular interest for us, because that is providing 100% of funding, and we have submitted funding bids to undertake some of those measures within the decarbonisation plans. For example, LED lighting improvements within West Offices and Hazel Court, but the vast majority of them do require match funding, and we have no, as of now, we don't have a source for that match funding.
Thank you. Councillor Waller.
Thank you, Chair. It's actually 29 years since the first motion to set a carbon reduction. Councillor may remember, it was the first motion I managed to get through full council. The work that's happened since then in terms of breaking down to a building and project level has been critical, and the first carbon management programme did a lot of that, and we're sitting in one of the specific projects to reduce emissions. I think it's understanding the work that's going into those changes, which include the LED lighting, and that programme of works that energise mean that together with staff chasing down consumption of energy means that that's now aerated, and that's a positive step which we need to look at for other buildings. But it does require different decision making, whether it's someone setting the thermostat or someone investing in the capital programme. And I pay tribute to the work that the team within education do in terms of some of our rather old buildings, bringing them up to a more energy efficient level. and ensuring that access to support within the city is brought in. So Acomb Library, there's people going in from the University of York as part of that redevelopment. So it's really making sure that all of those strands are captured and it's coordinated across the whole of the council portfolio, and that we can actually see that rather than sort of there's lots of bits happening over there and it's not quite brought together. So I think there needs to be that overall view, so that when you do get reports, because each time you do these massive assessments, things change and the science keeps changing, understanding of where the carbon is coming from, where it's going to, but that there's an overall view of we are taking those steps that are necessary, and that we can record that, and ideally that we are registering where we have saved energy bills, which we would otherwise have, putting even more pressure on the council's budgets. Thank you, Chair.
Want to respond to any of that?
Only that's an excellent challenge. We'll take it away. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Quick question for me. I was looking at the paragraph 11 and paragraph 36 talks about setting intermediate targets for indicators we do not currently have can be sort of challenging, and paragraph 36 talks in similar terms. I suppose it's from reading the report, what I was trying to get clear in my mind is being clear about the benefits that would arise as by going down that path, notwithstanding the sort of challenges that are set out in terms of availability of data and being able to have meaningful year-on-year comparisons. So what benefits do you think would it bring in terms of we know what the destination is in terms of us achieving that?
So we'll do a double act. So I'll start and then hand over to Sean, if that's all right. So there are potentially benefits from setting targets, output targets for council to meet our 4%, to deliver net zero by reducing our own emissions, which will obviously contribute to that 4% that equates to the totality of emissions for the whole citywide area. And that could be, for example, setting targets around our fleet, our buildings we've talked about, our lighting, our energy, all sorts of things around our waste, our water consumption, all sorts of different things that equate to council and how the council operates. There are significant challenges, obviously, from setting targets for citywide emissions reduction, not least because we don't own or have availability of all the levers that would lead to those meeting those targets. So I'll hand over to Sean.
Yeah, I think that the value would depend on the indicator itself and would vary. All of the indicators included within the draft scorecard on Annex 2 are indicators that we currently have information for or have a plan to gather that information for, and that all goes through our business intelligence team currently or will do in the future. And so there's no additional work required to keep those indicators up to date. And we think that that is a good reflection of the activity that we're delivering to contribute towards net zero. It's a suitable and applicable way to track progress. It's not all of the potential indicators. There are a couple of others that I could think of that we could include, but we don't currently have access to information for, or would be really challenging, really difficult, time consuming or expensive to access. And you have to weigh up the benefit against accessing the cost of accessing that information. I think within Annex 2 and the indicators that we've provided, there should be sufficient information there to at least monitor, to give you sufficient confidence to monitor progress and challenge progress against our net zero target. And in my view, the value of adding more indicators into that basket would be minimal when offset against the time and cost required to capture that data.
Okay, so so we're talking about indicators and we're talking about targets. So am I right thinking that expanding the number of indicators would enable us to better understand where we are on the pathway? I'm trying to get clear in my head. We can, and paragraph 10, there's lots of kind of additional indicators. I suppose what I'm trying to be, for my understanding, is how will increasing the number of indicators that we have and collect enable us to, is it a case of setting new targets? Is it understanding where we are on the pathway? What benefits will arise from the expansion in the number of indicators collected in terms of setting intermediate targets?
This is right at the heart of the challenge that we have, that because we are getting access. We talk just about our organisational emissions. We talk about more access to information, more data becoming available. Setting year-on-year targets for emissions reduction becomes quite challenging and means that sometimes year-on-year that information isn't comparable, and it might not show progress against that target. That's where the indicators have more value, because it demonstrates the actions that we've been taking and the progress that we've been taking towards net zero, even if we can't as accurately report on those emissions year on year.
Okay, no, thank you. It's helpful. I'll bring Councillor Revillis in a moment. Just Councillor Healy.
Sort of a supplemental, but sort of trying to actually answer the question that has been posed to us. Would I be correct in surmising that the indicator GCC02 at the bottom of page 50 and GCC03, 03 would capture the council's totality of emissions, and 02 would capture the city's totality of emissions? So in simplistic terms, if I wanted to answer the question that was posed on point 4 and point 5b, I would take whatever the current number is, and admittedly one of them's still not available, and I'll divide it by 7 and have a straight line down. Yep, simplistically.
You would, but with the caveat that GCO3, total emissions from our operations, there might be changes in the data availability. For example, we're including schools for the first time this year. We haven't previously, so it might not show that linear track downwards, but yes.
Okay, good. Thank you very much.
Sorry, I overlooked Councillor Widdowson, which I'll be in trouble, so I'd like to bring
it. Just more or less what Councillor Healy was saying, and also you can do the comparison going backwards because you can get historic data for the last 2 or 3 years, so you can actually, do a regression analysis on it. To use a fancy term, just get the data for the last few years and put the data in. But to move it towards what we're asked to do in point 4, thoughts on that, Sean, are I would be keeping and maintaining the use of the nationally robust recognised data that's from the set of tools. I know that it's 2 years behind, fully appreciate that it's got issues, but I would be keeping that to make it more robust, if that wants to be the term that the new administration wish to do, by putting in interim targets. And I recognise that there's an interim target in there, and I recognise that it's been done by experts at the University of Leeds that you have worked long and close with. Would it be sensible to look at not the scorecard, because I genuinely think that's going to muddy the water. You can do an awful lot of things, but they may or may not change the outcome. Right? You can make work happen, but it doesn't mean it's causal. And some of those I would say are not causal. Talking to the people in our city that think we've done a good job, I'm not sure that is causal in actually reducing emissions. And there are quite a few things on there that I would challenge. So maybe those pointers are within the projects, maybe. And maybe the things that we all talk about above that are, you know, going back to what Councillor Healy said, straight line down, about the reduction in scope 1 and 2 emissions, which we've got, building in the scope 3 emissions, allowing for the inaccuracy in there, because there's going to be 20, 30, 40% inaccuracies from everything that you talk about. If you read what the expert papers on it say, they say that scope 3 can be anywhere between 3 and 24 times what scope 1 and 2 is. That's a huge variation. So you need to build in that inaccuracy. So you need to find a way of getting the scope 3 analysis, but keep tracking the scope 1 and 2, and then keep backing onto the scatter data. Looking at some of these, and some of it seems to be being done more for air quality. Is there something to put in there? Because the targets seem to be within the next 4 years to sort the air quality target. So a straight line graph of 1 in 4, that's already being tracked. That will give you a proxy for what's happening with emissions. I know it's a proxy, but it will do. And then finally, the only one of all the scorecard ones I would put in is to make sure that all the vehicles that are owned, all and any vehicles that are owned by CYC are either EV or ultra low emissions by 2028, and just again showing a straight line graph for how that's happening, which I know was put in place 2-3 years ago for the smaller vehicles, along with the large waste vehicles that are all ultra low diesel or ultra low emissions rather. And I know that there is a project plan to make that happen. I would keep it at that level, because I genuinely don't think some of the scorecard statements are causal. But what are your thoughts on that?
No, thanks, Councillor. Yeah, definitely present that as recommendation within the paper that goes to executive, or as an option, I should say, within the paper that goes to executive. And I'll have a closer look at the scorecard indicators to identify which ones may or may not be more or less causal.
Thank you. Before I bring Councillor Rivelis in, I'll just see if there are any more questions. Then you can maybe say what you want, reflect on what you've heard, and make any of the comments you wish. Councillor Merrick.
Yes, on the scorecard issue, hear what you say, Sean, about the worth of doing additional ones, but coming back to the scope 3, I wonder whether there might be appropriate to have some limited additional ones to tackle that particular set of emissions, and perhaps the 3 initial ones might, or at least the 2 initial ones would be percentage of our contracts that have that have GHG reporting. The second one would be the actual reporting content, which obviously initially will be not very accurate, but over time, as we move to get comprehensive reporting, should be increasingly so and becoming increasingly meaningful, so that we are taking it into proper account. There was a third one which will come back to me. I'll email you separately.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, you can also include that within the options paper that goes to executive.
Okay. Sorry, Councillor Rivelis, for making you wait. Yeah, over to you.
Thank you. Yeah, it's really interesting to hear the discussion that's happened, and I'm very up for looking at that scorecard and thinking about how we refine it to really help us measure what we want to measure and avoid distraction. And one of the sort of things I don't notice perhaps enough in there, and I'll be interested to hear what others think, is whether there's a way we can measure modal shift, because one of the big changes we want to achieve over the coming years will be reducing our transport emissions. And in particular, we've focused a lot on looking at the move to electric vehicles, which is great, but we haven't got many measures in there to tell us about whether people are changing the way that they travel or traveling less. So I know that the travel team collect data on a number of vehicle miles driven and cycling levels and this kind of thing, and whether we can bring some of that in to just get that feel of how we're doing on reducing transport emissions as a proxy might be useful. So that was my thought on the scorecard refining, but I'm really interested to hear what's come out of this discussion here. And just on the thinking about why we might want to set an intermediate target, my thinking is that we also have to consider political cycles. And it would be all too easy for our administration to do nothing, get to 2027, and then the next administration, whoever they may be, leave them with the problem of getting to net zero by 2030. So it's about holding each political cycle to account in terms of demonstrating that they're making progress. And so although we can't measure it year by year by year, and it doesn't go evenly and smoothly, it would still, I feel, be really useful to have some kind of intermediate target around the end of this political cycle, and to be thinking in political cycles as well as our 2030 target. Just thoughts.
Thank you very much. I'm looking around for any further comments or questions from members. Councillor Merritt.
I also think intermediate targets are important. The reality is it's only 7 years. And only one intermediate target, if it's 2027, perhaps isn't enough. You know, if we are going to see how well we're doing, we probably at least halfway through this administration need to have a look how this administration is going, and whether we can, if it's not going right, can what we can do to remedy the situation, perhaps say in about 2 years' time. And the next administration may want to do the same in terms of halfway to their administrations to the end of 2030. So yes, I do support intermediate targets, but I think they should be kept simple, because we don't want to bog officers down with major amount of additional work. It's really just to get an overall sense of how things are going, so we can ask questions and put challenges at the appropriate points.
Okay, thank you. Councillor Widdowson, then I think we'll draw this agenda item.
I promise I'll be brief.
Thank you.
Absolutely agree, Councillor Merritt, with what you're saying, so long as the targets are recognised rather than some of the stuff that I've seen in the scorecard. So what I would suggest, if we're going to look at it year on year, what I would suggest is going back to what you've got in here, which is the carbon emissions for the city and the carbon emissions for ourselves, because you can collect all the carbon emissions for ourselves. You know the fleet, you know the buildings, we know because we're paying the bills. And I suggest we do the straight line graph against each one of those. And if we can come back as soon as that information is available. You said that it's available September this year. September 23 will be available now.
It is available. Sorry, yes, it is available now. We're just finalising the report, and it'll be coming to future exec member decision session.
Okay, so if we could, I don't know if it's possible to have that reported at the start of November every year, but literally against those two things with the scorecard in the background, because they're the two things that we're talking about. Okay, and it would be scope 1, 2 and 3. So therefore, is there a way of, I don't know, from what I've said and from what you've said, of, I don't know how you draw it to a close, Councillor Fenton.
Thank you. This is obviously this is the first discussion we've had. There'll be further discussions. There will be a report to executive, and I think when we see that, we can think, well, what do we want to do as a scrutiny to add value? I think we've fed in comments to help inform an ongoing piece of work. I think then we can, once the executive has sort of decided on the course of action in terms of how it wants to set intermediate targets, we can then either be invited by the executive, or we can decide how we want to sort of further input as best we can.
Specific things that the committee wants to put forward for inclusion.
I mean, I think from the discussion we've had, a number of ideas have been put forward in terms of things that could be included, things that might be challenging to include. I haven't had a sense of very, very specific recommendations that perhaps would you like to make a specific recommendation?
I disagree. I thought I already had. Sorry, I thought that's what I'd done. I know that, let me just pull it up again because I made sure that I'd written it down because I've got a memory like a sieve at times. So I would like to recommend that we maintain the use of the nationally robust recognised data using the scatter methodology and dates as agreed in the adopted climate strategy. So I think that is the backbone. Then I would add in the following annual targets from the current baseline, which is scope 1. So it's a 1 in 7 reduction in scope 1 and 2 emissions starting from now through to 2030. A 1 in 7 reduction in scope 3 emissions from now, with the caveat of what I said is that the scope 3 emissions are interesting. Okay. 3, 1 in 4 improvement in air quality, which is what the executive said that they wanted, because that was their target, and it gives you a proxy for if other stuff is happening, which means that you don't have to do all the transport data, you don't have to take all of that into account, and you also make sure that you're keeping an eye on wood burners across the city, which are one of the biggest air pollutants that we've got. And then finally, if my computer works itself in front of me, tracking that all CYC vehicles move to EV or ultra low emissions by 2028 as per the agreed project, because I know some of them have slipped in the last 3 or 4 months. That's what I will put as a specific recommendation.
So are these indicators, are these targets?
The target is 1, 2 and 3, 4 is the indicator. That's all it is.
Right.
And the first one about the scatter data is a target, because you've got the graph from the University of Leeds.
Okay. Councillor Merritt. Yeah.
There was a mix of recommendations there, and some were quite specific, like the fleet. I think it would be wrong for us to agree a recommendation as specific as that without at least having some understanding of both the costs, practicalities, and so on of doing that. I must admit, I'd prefer to leave it in the sense of the sort of passing the generalised comments we've had forward to the executive and to the officers, and I'm broadly supportive of the the straight line as a starting point for the intermediate targets. But I think that's really, I don't think we have the knowledge and expertise to be too specific in our recommendations. I think they need to be filtered through officer recommendations and discussion at the executive.
I think what would be helpful to have is sort of an officer commentary, not now, on, and a lot of the things that Councillor Widdowson spoke about, I've not an expert, so don't have as detailed understanding as perhaps she might do. But for us to ask officers to comment by correspondence on the deliverability, achievability of some of those recommendations, which in principle I don't have a problem with, but would appreciate a bit more information. Claire?
Could I just ask a question of scrutiny as well? So one of the comments, I think from Councillor Widdowson, but forgive me, I might have got the wrong councillor, was whether to bring back an emissions report to scrutiny early, probably late October, ready for publication November, against that trajectory of showing emissions hopefully being reduced. And then one of the comments from Councillor Waller was around showing, somehow presenting the totality of the programme. So as well as seeing how emissions are reducing, you get an understanding of the impact that the officers are having to influence that reduction. Is that something that Scrutiny would like to consider as an annual, kind of an annual event, if you like?
I think anything that brings to life, that points to actual measures relating to buildings, premises that we're aware of, council activities that we see every day, to make it more relatable, I think would be a good thing to have. Councillor Eyre, do you have anything to add?
Mine was incredibly simple in terms of, obviously not the complicated as that, but Paul has touched on, Councillor Widdowson touched on part of it and Councillor Murray disagreed. I was actually just looking at page 21. And if we're going to get our emissions down, it was the question I asked. 2/3 of our emissions are gas boilers and vehicles. So I fully support the year-on-year target of that. I mean, there's only two ways we do that. That is either switch to electric or we drive less miles. I don't think we're going to suggest shortening the waste routes, for example. They're going to increase, if anything. So it is going to be about switching to EV. So that is a year-by-year measurable. And second, the only way you're going to reduce the other third around gas boilers is getting rid of gas boilers. So I think I have absolutely no, that should be a specific target in there. There should be if we're going to achieve that over the next 2030, you have to take out those gas boilers as a structured program. So that should be an interim target. If we're 5 years down, not 2 years down the line, or 5 years down the line, and well, I suppose there is closing swimming pools is the other option in terms of reducing that particular one, but it is about removing gas boilers. So why should that not be a measurable? We would want to know with Scrutiny year on year how many of those gas boilers have gone, how many of those vehicles have switched to EV. That is a very simple thing to measure, and that will show us that we're nowhere near doing our own. And the other thing I suppose about that is I thought it's also about setting the right message to members of the public. If we're expecting members of the public to do things in a certain way, if we're expecting them to shift the way they heat their homes, we're expecting them to shift the way they travel, etc., it's absolutely fundamental on us that we do exactly the same and demonstrate that we're prepared to. If we say we're not going to replace any of our gas boilers and we're not going to measure the amount of shift from diesel to EV, why would any sensible member of the public want to listen to us on climate change?
Okay, Councillor Kent.
Councillor, do you mean specifically with gas boilers? I'm reluctant for Scrutiny to place a direct, well, you can recommend it and we can discuss it, so it's good to air it, but do you mean replacing as in ripping out, or do you mean replacing end of life? Because there are also questions about embedded carbon. I don't know, there are difficult calculations to be done on that. If we said we could remove them all instantly, is that actually the best thing to do? It would immediately reduce some emissions, but longer term that might have a detrimental effect. So that's a slightly more nuanced question.
I was oversimplifying. I would say in terms of paragraph 17 says that there are heat decarbonisation plans for all of those. So it would be delivery of 28 of those heat decarb. So your annual target is how many of those plans have been delivered per year.
Okay, so we're talking about the purpose of this discussion is about exploring benefits, disbenefits of moving towards a system of having intermediate targets. What I don't want this to get into is a very in-depth discussion about all the things we could do. That's an entirely separate discussion. And I'm sure over time we'll give even more serious consideration to things that would need to happen in order to not just hit intermediate targets, but the ultimate target of 2030 and beyond. So in terms of any specific recommendations around what we're here to discuss, which is the merits or otherwise of setting intermediate targets, does anyone else have anything they want to add? Councillor Healy.
Super quickie. So is the recommendation going to be that we monitor GCCO2, which is the city's emissions, and GCCO3, which is the council emissions, in totality over a straight line 7-year period to meet the objectives of being carbon neutral by 2030? Because that would seem to be what we've been asked to do by full council. This isn't a noting a great report. This is we're specifically here because full council asked us to do something.
It asked us to explore the issue to inform the work that is being done that will inform an executive decision. So if you want to recommend that you are supportive of GCC O2 and O3 forming part of an expanded set of indicators to help inform intermediate targets, that's fine. Is that what you would like to propose?
To measure it declining over 7 years, picking up council merits.
The starting point is to actually have the indicators.
We have, it's here, it exists.
Yes. So what's your recommendation?
So the recommendation is that we track GCCO2, which is the city's emissions, on a straight line to get us to carbon neutrality by 2030. So that's your, as it says here, intermediate carbon reduction targets. A nice, simple one number each year. And then you pick up GCCO3, which picks up all the council activities, be it fleet, be it heating, be it whatever. And we say the same thing for that. So we picked up the council, we picked up the city, we've got intermediate targets, and it gets us to carbon neutral. No, wait there.
So your preference would be to have no other indicators other than those, no other additional indicators other than those.
The recommendation is, because all of these indicators, none of them track downwards. There's no sort of targets. We're giving intermediate targets, and those two indicators encapsulate all of the other scorecarding that's on here.
Right. Okay, so we've had a slew of recommendations from Councillor Widdowson, some additional recommendations from Councillor Healy. What I said when I was trying to close down this agenda item was that in terms of coming to a view as to the achievability of what's being recommended, what I suggested was that officers be asked to go away and provide feedback on some of the suggestions that are being made, which I think hopefully will be helpful for members of the committee as well as for members of the executive. Councillor Waller.
Thank you. If I can just potentially refine Councillor Ayres' comment in terms of gas boilers, is to more positively register it as a monitoring of air source heat pumps as a mechanism to illustrate the skills requirement within the city.
Okay. Again, that can be added in as something that hopefully is measurable in terms of delivery of those new technologies. Would anybody else like to add anything else to the list of things we're going to ask officers to consider and feedback to us on to help inform the work that will culminate in an executive report? Councillor Merritt.
I think round the table we flagged a number of things which I think would all be useful for officers to look at briefly, at least, in terms of potential work. Perhaps the big overall decision that we should make tonight is to agree that there ought to be intermediate targets. I think there's been reasonable unanimity around the table. The points that Nigel made were well made in terms of the big significant blocks that need to be tackled in terms of our own emissions. And really what that needs is a reasonably thought out programme of how those are going to be delivered, and that may not be linear, but at least for pro tem, we can look at a linear until a more informed timetable comes back. But I think we've got to give space for that work to be done and that more informed timetable to hopefully appear in due course, because otherwise we're not going to deliver the targets.
Thank you. I think a number of members have made suggestions for a number of intermediate targets that they believe would be achievable and helpful, some more expansive than others. So I think, as you say, there is sort of broad agreement on the usefulness of having some of those, maybe disagreement on the scope, but that's something that no doubt we'll come back and discuss as more granular information is available. Would anybody like to add anything else before we move on to the next agenda item? No. Thank you very much, members, for share. Sorry. I've had a request for a brief 5-minute adjournment, so let's do that. Thank you, everyone. So we're now on to agenda item 6. This is a report on the Blue Badge application process. So this agenda item came about as a result of a request from one of our committee members, Councillor Burton. So what's been prepared is a report that describes the process in place. It describes some engagement with disability advocacy groups, which some of the public speakers referred to. So the purpose of this agenda item is primarily so the members have the information that was requested, and also for members to consider whether, as written in the report, whether we wish to undertake a deeper review, including looking at best practice elsewhere, within any requirements set down by the DFT, and considering the views of stakeholder organisations and users of the service. So this is, I suppose, an opportunity for members to think about, is there anything in the report? Is there anything we've heard that would lead us to wish to do some further work, maybe perhaps through a task and finish group? So with that, I will hand over to officers, if you can introduce yourselves and briefly introduce the report. Thank you.
Thank you, Chair. I'm Pauline Stutchfield, Director of Customer and Communities, and my colleague Phil Bell is here. He's the Business Support Services Manager who manages within a wider remit the Blue Badge application process, and a very small team that processes those applications. So I'll introduce, and if I want to follow up with any other detail. I'm not going to go through the process in detail. You'll be pleased to know the report does talk you through the application process, what happens to the applications in terms of the initial sift, and allocation of badges to those that are automatically entitled to badges, and then those that go on to a further assessment process. That further assessment process in itself is in 2 stages. One is a desk exercise, again, to determine whether people can proceed on to receive a blue badge because of the evidence that they submitted, or then finally go on to a physical assessment as the final part of the process. Once the decisions are made, there are a number of applications that aren't approved. And just to give you a picture on some statistics that are not in the report, from the last 4 years data, 83.5% of applications are approved. So that's around 16.5% not approved. Those not approved, there is an appeal process that people can go on to, a 2-stage appeal process. The first stage looks at the information that was submitted and the decision, the process that was followed. The second stage is the ability to add additional information, and that's assessed by somebody who's higher in the managerial process. As you can see in the report from paragraph 23 and from the public speakers today, we did hold a session a couple of weeks ago with York Access Forum, and there is a significant amount more information that is going to be available very soon. We're just working through all of that information because the York Access Forum members made a request for further data, so that's being pulled together, and that includes things like what were the reasons for rejection, so we can understand that in a bit more detail. You can also see in that paragraph the suggestions that were made to improve the existing process. And some of those are already being taken forward. For example, the availability of paper forms through third-party community and voluntary organisations, and publishing the Blue Badge application process as a process flowchart. So we're on with those things. They're easier to do. Other things include improving information to those who are accessing the process, and particularly around providing a clearer explanation around what a patient summary is, how to obtain it, and the relevance of that information to completing the blue badge form. And particularly significant to how we could make the process more efficient in the future is the area around making the application process easier after the first successful application. And we were referred to other local authorities such as Leeds that have already done this. And I think members of this committee may have been written to as soon as today, as I have, to talk about experience in other authorities as well. So there's definitely room for opportunity to explore those process improvements further. Just to respond to the residents' comments at the beginning of the meeting, I do apologise for the language that's still in this report that reflects the timescales of from that meeting to publication and to getting the papers in front of you, and we will learn and we will improve. Also, the point made around the risks. The risk is identified because of the tiny resource we've got in the authority for managing this process. Clearly, if we can make improvements on making some of the parts of the process more efficient, which is a win-win for both the applicant and ourselves, then that we can manage that risk much better going forward. So as you said, Chair, the recommendations are at paragraph 5. We absolutely welcome the committee's input, working with residents and other stakeholders who are really keen to work with you on and us on an improved process. Don't know if there's anything you want to add, Phil.
Thank you. So my name's Phil Bell, sorry, no name card. I'm business support manager. I have operational responsibilities for blue badges. I've got nothing really further to add than what Pauline said, but I obviously would just like to say that, you know, over the last few months, we've had some very good, very positive and engaging conversations with a number of organisations actually, which has allowed us to try and improve the service. And I think obviously, you know, I welcome your questions and your comments in terms of what we can do to further improve and make sure our process is, you know, is as fair as possible and as simple as possible for everyone who wants to use it. And I think obviously, you know, I'm very positive about the service myself in terms of the way that I think we're going into the right direction. And I think we need some further assistance with the process in terms of a steer on things like what Pauline has mentioned there. When a person applies again after already having a badge, I think that can be an area where we're certainly very keen to hear thoughts and comments on. So yeah, I just welcome comments and questions. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. And just to add, I know members of the committee will have received an email earlier today from I think it was the local Parkinson's UK group sharing some of their thoughts and examples of approaches used with other authorities. So it's clearly an issue that people do care about and want to be part of, you know, helping to make improvements wherever possible. So and I think other members may have received other written representations as well. So do any members have any comments, questions? Councillor Burton.
Yes, I mean, I was very glad I took part in the meeting on the 29th, and I think it was a very positive meeting, and a lot of good things came out of it, which are in the report and recommendations. So I really think it's a good idea to look at other authorities and see how they're working and doing, especially with this situation where people are reapplying for badges and being turned down. I did bring up at the time, I think it's Access Independent, that several people got in touch querying the way that assessors were being hired, I suppose, by them, because they're online advertising. If you pay £60, you can become an assessor for Access Independent. I don't know if you'd progress that any further.
Yeah, I remember the question actually.
Yeah.
So we have engaged with Access Independent about it. I can't say for certain I've got a response at this point. What they've done is acknowledged my email query, because obviously we took away a number of feedback points. So obviously we will add that into further feedback when we get the answer. I'm not even 100% sure if that's maybe just part of the sector in terms of how they go about the recruitment for trained medical professionals as they recruit within these organisations, and that could very well be what it is. But yes, so I don't have an exact answer for you yet, but as soon as I do, I will feed that back.
Thank you. I mean, I think it'd undermine people's confidence, especially those that have been turned down, who'd already had one for quite some time.
Yeah.
May I just carry on?
Yeah, please.
And I notice in here it says evidence from a GP is not sufficient. And I know that sometimes with the PIP process, that's the case, and that might be DFT guidance, but primarily now GPs are concerned with providing pain management with patients. So I don't know what can happen with that, but if it's DFT guidance, that it should be just GPs evidence that's not sufficient, because some people, you might have been to a specialist some years ago, had a diagnosis, there's nothing more you can do apart from manage the situation. So I think that needs to be looked at again as well.
I'll just, if you just
yeah.
pause at that point,
Yeah.
Councillor Lomas indicated if you want to respond to that.
Yeah, I think that might be a slight confusion over the wording. It doesn't mean that GP's information is disregarded. It just means that it needs to be an assessment by an assessor, which will take into account the GP information as well as the assessment. So it's not saying that GP information is disregarded.
Thank you.
Right.
Do you have any further points you wanted to raise?
If I think
You've got the floor. Yes, please do.
I think, reviewing the decision rather than appealing a decision, to make that clearer, again, that's in your notes, that would be really helpful, because people think they have to appeal rather than, and they're very put off. And I think some of the public speakers mentioned that, a lot of the appeals or reviews were successful, but that 96% of people give up. I know that's the case. Well, I don't know if the same percentages are right in PIP appeals, but people feel that they're being turned down, and I'm sure that's not the case here. And they just give up because they don't have the strength to carry on. So I think making that very clear that you've got those choices is a good thing.
And one of the action points we're working on currently is to design sort of the flow chart, if you like, of what the process will be. So any potential applicant can see what stage their application may or may not end up in terms of a decision, potential assessment, appeal, and what that is before a person even applies, so they can understand kind of what the application journey will be. So we're certainly hopeful that will, well, I'm working on that currently with the team anyway, and that will be in terms of ready for a review within senior management within the next week or so, and that can then be something that we can publish to help people understand exactly what will happen when they go through the blue badge application process, which I think will help in terms of some of those questions that person has before the application starts.
I'll just bring some of the members in, but I'll definitely come back, Councillor Burton. Councillor Merritt.
Obviously, given the pressure on the service, and I know the substantially increased numbers in the tables, what we can do to simplify and make processes easier isn't just going to be a benefit to applicants, it's also potentially a benefit to us under severe financial pressure and pressure obviously of catering for a larger number of people. So the two things in that regard seem to be the renewal process, whether we can in effect reduce the necessity to in effect repeat things if there has been no change in a person's condition. And the other one is the issue around the patient summary information and whether we can actually shortcut getting that patient summary information in any way, or at least helping make sure it gets picked up and identified early on so that people aren't chasing around. So those out of the report and some of the representations that we've received, those seem two particular important focuses for me in terms of what we could potentially try and do differently.
Okay. Thank you, Councillor Merritt. Councillor Taylor.
Thank you, Chair. It'd be interesting to see what the response is from officers to Councillor Merritt's statement, I suppose, just then. One question I had, and at risk of sounding flippant, and this is with regards to the recommendations. Do we need a scrutiny review to get into this? I mean, at the end of the paper, it lists a number of possible ideas for process improvements, some of which are already taking place. My fear with a scrutiny review would be that it just adds more months, and it would be many months onto this process. And if there's things we're already doing now, or things that we know that we could do right now if we wanted to, or with executive permission, can we just do that? And the council could still work with relevant people and groups in parallel. Maybe I'm wrong, and I'm open to members to challenge on this, but putting in a scrutiny review just adds something in as another layer that doesn't really seem to me to be of much benefit, other than giving members more time to talk, and we have ample opportunity for that. Again, at risk of sounding flippant.
No.
You get the point.
I'll ask officers to respond to Councillor Merritt's comments, but before I do, I'll ask if anyone else has any further points they want to raise. Councillor Burton, I can see you've got post-it notes on your.
I think I've covered my constituency. Thank you very much, Chair.
I think it was certainly a legitimate outcome. Is we've received a report, we've seen the action underway. We'll keep an eye on it. What I think will be an ongoing dialogue with the people who you met with in September. If any members want to, of their own accord, do a bit of research looking at the examples from Lancashire and elsewhere, there's absolutely no harm in any of us doing that work, feeding it through to Pauline and her team, saying, this is an example of where a local authority is taking a particular approach. You might want to factor that into kind of service planning within the council. So yeah, it's entirely appropriate that we may know what the work is being done, want to keep a watching brief, and it may be at some point we do want to do a piece of a sort of task and finish group, but certainly no expectation that we must do that. I don't know if you want to reflect on any of the comments that have been made.
It's entirely up to scrutiny, really. We've certainly benefited from the rapid learning that scrutiny can do within their meetings if the timing is relatively swift. Clearly, we're going to be working on some of these issues anyway, because it's in our interest to be able to do so, as Councillor Taylor said, and Councillor Merritt, if there are things that will make our processes more efficient, we must get on with them because we've identified them already. However, the time taken to see what's going on in other authorities and identifying best practice just might take us a little bit more time. We will be re-engaging with YAF and talking through the improvements that we want to do, because we've committed to working with them to do so. So that will happen anyway.
Yeah. Councillor Taylor.
Thank you for that. I guess one question further to it would be, so far in the deliberations, discussions that have taken place on this, are there any other local authorities that you've come across or been informed about whose interpretation of the DFT guidance might represent an improvement for people here if we took it on? Because I guess my point is guidance, and every local authority will have a slightly different take on it. Yeah, there might not be any that come to mind at the minute, and just a point of curiosity.
Leeds are the ones that our volunteers within York, our community and voluntary sector in York, have got experience of Leeds, and we've had a brief look at that. Parkinson's UK have pointed to some others. Now, Parkinson's UK are coming from a slightly different angle, rather than making the reapplication process easier. A blanket approach across all reapplications. They're also saying there are some conditions that warrant automatic allowance for a blue badge. Now that's extending beyond the guidance of the DFT. So that's something slightly different and would require, I think, quite a clear policy change on that you might want to recommend it to executive.
Okay. Any further comments from members? If not, thank you for the report. It's so I found it very interesting in terms of being more informed for discussions I have with residents as to some of the issues that they encounter, and it's encouraging to see that the work that is underway with advocacy groups to identify improvements. So, and as I said, the invitation is open to members. If you want to do some research and pull together examples of what other local authorities are doing, there's Scrutiny is meant to be member led. We can do that work individually. You can get together with colleagues and share information with officers that I'm sure they'd find helpful. Councillor Burton.
I just wanted to reiterate how helpful the meeting that we had on the 29th was, and how positive people felt afterwards as well. I think it's great.
Yeah, no, that's good. Good. Yes.
Sorry, thank you. I know we often say this about almost every item that comes to scrutiny, but could we add it to our sort of future wish list to have a look at this in a year's time? You know, so we see what progress is. I do know that some work's already been done to improve process, and there's items listed as things we could do. But between now and then, there might be other changes that get proposed or implemented.
Okay, yeah, we'll make a note to add it, keep it on the work plan to come back, in a year's time and see where we are. Yeah.
Could I also just, final point, miss, it wasn't just York Accessibility Forum that inputted, so that if other organisations would still be included as well, and perhaps, you know, Kim Snape from Parkinson's UK, as well as others, that would be really helpful too.
Yeah.
If that's okay.
Yeah, I think that's
yes, of course.
that's accepted. Super. Thank you very much for the report and the discussion. Thank you. Okay, moving on. Agenda item 7. Election Act 2022 and City of York Council elections 2023. So this is a excuse me, an information report for members, providing an update on the first year of operation of photographic ID being required at the polling station, and an update on performance in relation to postal votes. So as a committee, as members, we don't organise elections. That's rightly the job of officers. But clearly we have an interest, and our residents have an interest and like to talk to us about the organisation of elections. And Scrutiny has some years ago done some scrutiny work on election organisation. So thank you to Bryn Roberts for the report. Is there anything you would like to say by way of introduction?
I don't think so, Chair. I think members will doubtless have read it. I think the implementation of particularly the Election Act and the photo ID requirement is probably the biggest shake-up in electoral law in, I'm going to say 10, 15 years at least. My new head of democratic governance, Lindsay Tomlinson, who's joining us this evening, is also an elections law specialist. So we are fortunate to have at least 1.5 brains here working on this. Sadly, this part of the Elections Act is actually not the majority. So there are many more substantially more challenging changes to come. But I think this was probably the one that most people would see most immediately if they are electors who turn up to polling stations to vote. I think if you look at the figures that I've included in the report, we did substantially better than most when it came to voter ID, in terms of the number of people who ultimately were not able to vote at a polling station because they didn't have any suitable. We also turned away a substantially lower number than in other areas, even for those who returned later on. I think we are at about 40% of the average that the Electoral Commission came up with when it surveyed the whole of all of those authorities who had run elections this year. And I say, if you look at some of our perhaps near neighbours, not necessarily a fair comparison, but Bradford was almost 7.5 times the rate that we had in terms of rejections at polling stations. So I think in terms of implementation, an awful lot of the credit for that goes down to particularly the council's comms team and an enormous amount of work that they put in ahead of time to ensure that we did a substantial amount of engagement across both print media, audio media and social media. And you'll see at the back, I've included an annex just with some of the details of the comms campaign and the impressions, as they call it, that they made across that period of time. In terms of postal votes, you'll see from the reports that we increased the number of postal voters that we had on our books by about 1,000 this time round. And as was reported to the council, and I think that's the only figures that we can go on, of those sort of 19,500 postal votes, we had less than 100 people contact us to indicate that they had not received theirs. And everyone who did contact us was offered the option of either have replacement postal vote being posted to them, hand delivered to them, or available for them to collect, whether it be from the council's offices or from polling stations. I personally delivered one to a polling station myself about 6:30 in the morning, so it was waiting for the elector. So on the basis of that, it is a sad fact that, as anybody who sends a substantial amount of post out will know, sometimes things go missing. And out of 17,500, if what we've had reported is less than 100, it's not too bad. We are, as part of this, as I've said in the report, we're happy to look at whether there are alternative ways of doing such delivery. So it is theoretically possible to do a hand delivery of all of those postal votes. The question becomes, is that a more efficient use of time and funds, given that in any event, the postage would have to be paid for them to be returned to the council through the Royal Mail. But it's something that we're happy to look at, because I think, you know, with all of these things, it's a learning exercise. No election is ever perfect. And it's one of the reasons that the legislation requires that you deliver it substantially in accordance with the regulations. A favourite phrase of returning officers. I think I'll probably stop at that, Chair. I'm happy to take any thoughts.
Thank you very much. Councillor Steels-Walshaw.
Yeah, just something that I would have really liked to see in the report was something around the accessibility of polling stations. I think there's one polling station in particular in Poppleton that's down a particularly unpaved track. There's steps to get into the polling station, and that can really put people off, with people with mobility issues, people with sight issues, people with pushchairs, people who it can be quite dark and lit. And I think it'd be really useful to see if there was a report on whether people were able to access their polling station and whether they were able to actually able to go and vote.
It's an interesting, so every polling station was visited by our access officer as part of this process, together with the head of legal, who between them were assessing these, just to ensure that they were all accessible. And we had nothing referred to us that would have caused us a substantial issue. You know, we were looking at issues as small as, do we need a ramp to go up a 3-inch lift? Because that's the sort of thing that we have to consider. As part of, you'll be aware that obviously there has been a parliamentary boundary review, and as part of that, we now have to do a polling place review for parliamentary elections, and we'll use that to do a full review of all of the council's polling stations. So as part of that exercise, you know, we will be contacting all of the local ward members with the question about, do you know of any venues in your area that are better than what you currently have, that are more helpful, more available? So I'd be delighted if you'd want to feed into that in that process.
Great, thank you. Councillor Merritt.
Thank you. I just wanted to explore the voter ID issue a little more. The turnover, the rejection rate that you gave, was that the rejection rate for people who actually got to the polling desk, or the rejection rate for those people who were met by greeters and persuaded not to go in?
I can say with absolute confidence, councillor, that it was the former, because we didn't employ greeters.
But you had people at the polling station doors asking people.
Well, we had additional poll clerks, but we didn't. So greeters were employed as people to stand outside the polling station and effectively check to see, have you got your ID? If not, you better go home and get it. We made the choice not to employ anyone in that role.
Right. So the people who were met at the entrance are part of the numbers that you and turned away were part of the numbers that you've counted.
Yeah, absolutely.
Right. Good.
So I'm just looking at some quizzical looks among members, because I thought that there were greeters.
I think perhaps what I'd best say then is, clearly, if members can have instances of that, then that was perhaps a decision taken by the presiding officer rather than us. We explicitly chose to employ additional poll clerks to sit in polling stations and run the process. If then the presiding officer has chosen to send one of them to stand outside, then I would be delighted to know where, because that's an issue that we can pick up with with those presiding officers.
I think looking at the number of hands that I
absolutely
know what a polling station I was at, there was a person fulfilling that role. Outside some of the time, inside some of the time, but very much the meet and greets. I don't know if any of the members, Councillor Lomas, then Councillor Taylor.
I just wanted to say it absolutely did happen. It happened a lot in a lot of different places. It may well have been a pragmatic response to the situation, but I fear that that means you have not collected all of the data about the people who were turned away, because they hadn't got into the polling, the room. And so I'm not sure how it would have been recorded. So the people standing in the foyers and doorways and corridors and all the other places they were standing in, they didn't have a copy of the electoral register. They weren't noting anything down. They were just looking at your ID. And because it happened to me when I went to vote, they looked at my ID and they said, yeah, that's okay, you can go in. And I'm certain that if I hadn't had ID, I would have been turned away there and no record would have been made of it. We also haven't collected any data on the people who didn't bother going to a polling station. And having knocked on a lot of doors in the weeks leading up to polling day, it was one of the most frequent conversations that I had with people was, have you got the right ID? Make sure you take it with you. And I spoke to many people, and Bryn will know because I referred lots of people to him, who were not clear that they had the right ID or they had a complicated situation, which they weren't sure about. And I wonder how many of those people just self-selected and didn't even leave their house on polling day because they thought, well, it's just a step too far. So I'm not sure if there's any way to estimate that, But I definitely think that we have an underreporting of people being turned away, because that was reported widely across the city, people being in corridors, foyers, doorways, whatever.
Okay, I think, and I think a number of members will have experienced a similar situation. Just while we're on the the sort of photo ID, are there any other observations or questions members want to ask on specifically on the photo ID? Councillor Waller.
Thank you. On the BAC forms, there was variable awareness of the ease by which they could be obtained. And so there were a number of people who found it very convenient, and they understood that was a way of overcoming them not having a passport or driving license. But equally, there were pockets where there was not the appreciation that there was a system. And I think underlying this is an attempt at voter suppression. That is an invidious process after a long period of British history where inclusion of people to be able to vote has increased. So I do worry that there were people who, as it passed, as a deadline passed, when speaking to people, that they were self-selecting and not turning up. And I just think that to have 358, I don't know whether there's been any checking of postcodes, but I would have thought, given the estimates nationally of how many people fell into that category, and it's unfortunate that you're dissuading first-time voters from going. Not you personally, but this whole system further complicated the way in which people engage with the democratic process. So I do worry that this is the first hurdle. There will be others, and looking across the pond, the prospect of polling stations being situated miles away from some communities, if the government so decides that's the way we're going, that is something that we need to hold out against.
So that's a bigger issue, and I want to ask Bryn's comment on most of that, in terms of you have to deal with the situation as it's presented to you. So
I think the only comment I would make, Chair, is my aim is to get as many people as possible to vote, whether that be in person, whether that be by post, by proxy, but however it is. My own view would be that the introduction of photo ID has not been helpful in that process. I think is probably as far as I would go.
Yes.
Bryn did allude earlier to the fact that there's more coming down the line towards us now in terms of the Elections Act. And one of the things that we're really concentrating on now, because it's going live very shortly, is online absent voting applications and the requirements around postal voting, which are going to make obtaining postal vote a little bit more tricky for people going forward. So whereas now you just have to fill in a form, give your name and your date of birth, and then you get a postal vote and it's sent out to you and that's all fine. Now you're going to have to apply and give your national insurance number to check that it is, that it is that person that's applying for that postal vote is the person that's getting it. So there's going to be that additional identity check. There's an online application process which is going live on the 31st of this month. People can still apply by paper. We'll just have to upload the application to the portal, but there will be that check against the DWP records. And if people haven't got a national insurance number, get it wrong, can't provide one, then there's an evidence submission process that we'll need to go through. So it just adds another few steps into that process for ensuring that people who want postal votes have got one. So I think early in the year we were encouraging people that if they didn't have identity documents, for voting the polling station, we encourage people to apply for post vote. There's going to be a little bit of a trickier process for them if they do want that absent vote instead. So
Okay.
don't
Thank
be
you.
very
No, that's
bad
fine.
news, but just so you're aware.
I'm conscious of time and there are a number of hands, so if we can, I'll take all the indications I've had, but if we can try and keep it brief and to the topic of the paper, that'd be good. Councillor Eyre.
I'll be very brief. Most people made the comments I was going to make on voter ID. The only bit that's missing from that is that last sentence from paragraph 19. And I think as a committee, we should not accept that as factually correct. That is 0.1% of people who got into a polling station disenfranchised. That was not, as both Councillor Lomas, Councillor Waller and Councillor Merritt said, we know there were significantly higher numbers of people disenfranchised by that. So I think we should know what that was. Yeah. And then only the wider point was, while I understand the postal votes going missing, I still never really had a reasonable explanation as to why people in my ward got 2 postal votes. That was particularly bizarre, particularly challenging, and I don't think we communicated particularly well what was going on around that.
Thank you. Councillor Merritt.
Yes, it's on the same issue that Andrew raised. If I read para 10, 9 and 10 correctly, 4% of the eligible population do not have an approved form of a photographic ID, assuming that's true for broadly true for York as well. That means there's potentially just under 6,000 York residents who fall in that category. So if we've only issued 358 papers, and correct me if I'm misinterpreting what you've said, then that means only 6% of that group of people actually got a vote, the potential to vote. 94% of that group didn't. I mean, that's pretty horrendous. So obviously we are stuck with the rules that there are, but it does strike me that some thought should be given to how we can try and engage with that group in future, in advance of elections, to see if we can actually get a much more reasonable take-up rate. That is abysmal. That is a disenfranchisement of a whole section of the population.
I'll carry on going around getting comments and then ask Bryn to respond or not as he wishes at the end. Thank you. Councillor Steele-Walshaw.
Yeah, mine was a comment around the advertising of you needed ID to vote and saying, and we use social media. Did we use any other social media platforms other than Facebook? Just to reach different age demographics. There's not a lot of people under 25 who are using Facebook. So yeah, I just wondered if we advertised on any other social media platforms. I only saw stuff on Facebook throughout the election reminding of voter ID, but probably to use more social media platforms to include everybody.
Yep. Thank you. Councillor Taylor, did I see your hands?
Yes, you did, Chair. Thank you. So further on comms, I know there's a big push in the run up to the election from comms to raise awareness of various messages. So I'm wondering, I don't know if Bryn can answer this, if comms on all things voter registration are a standing item in the council's sort of corporate comms plan, and if not, can we recommend that they become a standing item rather than something we do in the months running up to polling day? I mean, it's not like a revolutionary idea. We've just got to create the space in it. Council's tweeting about all sorts of stuff. A lot of it isn't really relevant or useful. So it's probably quite easy to find the space for something like this.
Okay, thank you very much. Any other comments anybody would like to? Councillor Baxter.
Thank you, Chair. Yeah, I just want to sort of reiterate Councillor Steele-Walshaw's comment. I think in York, when we have such a young population, loads of students as well, I think it's really important that students realise that they can vote in both locations and local elections. And I think, you know, it is really important to use lots of different social medias, you know, councils on LinkedIn, stuff like that. And you just need to catch everyone in sort of every space that you can get them, essentially, because a lot of young people don't vote and we obviously need to increase that. So yeah, just reiterating her comments, basically.
Okay, thank you. So Bryn, would you like to respond to any
I'll
of those
give it a whirl, Chair. So I'll start off with Councillor Ayer's question about the duplicate postal votes. That came down to a simple issue of human error at the printers. In essence, they had printed a duplicate set, which they printed an original set, which had an error. They therefore pulled those out of the pack, printed a fresh set, and then somebody put one set on top of the other and handed them all to the roll mail. So the duplicate postal votes all then went out. It doesn't affect how the election itself is run because we know that the duplicates have gone out, and therefore we can simply tell the electronic system that we use to check postal voting statements when they come in, that certain, half of these need to be disregarded. So in and of itself, it didn't impact on how the election was run. But you're right that, and it's one of the things I've mentioned in the paper, in comms terms, we needed to be more on the front foot, particularly with that, so that the public understood the situation far better than perhaps we'd let them. And it's a learning point that I've noted in the report, and we have to be clear on that. We were not as on the front foot as we should have been with that.
Just on that point, did you have a supplementary question?
Sure.
Super quickly, you said 2 went out and you electronically told the system to disregard half of them.
Yeah.
So are you saying that if person A had the first set and he sent it in, that would be would be counted? If person B sent in the second one, that would be counted too. So you didn't disregard a batch.
No, what happened is that you tell the system that the following postal vote numbers, because they're all individually barcoded, should be excluded from the system. So if you only send one in, whether it's the first one or the second one, then it's counted. If you send a second one in, the system recognizes, oh, hang on, I've already had something from this individual, because the barcodes will. So yeah,
that's fine.
Perhaps bad phraseology on my part.
That's understood.
It just excluded any duplicates that were sent in.
Yeah. Carry on.
If they change their mind, that's fine. They can get in touch. We'll issue them a third set. That's not a problem at all. So in terms of the sort of statistical query about engagement with disenfranchised voters, I think the biggest challenge we've got is we don't actually know how many people don't have the right ID. We don't have a list of it. What we had was an estimate from the Electoral Commission, an estimate from the government. But even so, and we don't, if we had a list of people who didn't, we could write to them all and we'd sort it out there and then. But again, it must form part of how we continue to try and get more people involved in electoral matters.
But we know from the census who the people are who don't drive cars and so on. Where the predominant numbers.
Unfortunately, we can't cross-reference that data.
Yeah,
carry on.
Exactly. No.
But you are right. If the statistics were right, then the number of people who applied for a voter authority certificate was almost woefully small in comparison to the number that perhaps should have needed one. If you look at the turnout that we had, the turnout was less than 29%, I think it was. I don't know whether that's the usual turnout for a local election in York, whether that's high, whether that's low, in terms of the number of people who actually attended a polling station. I can say, as I've said in the paper, that in terms of postal vote turnout, it was about 88%, which is substantially higher than any I've ever seen. From a turnout perspective on postal votes, you are extremely good. But there's always more work to do.
Okay.
Social media beyond Facebook. So there are some that we have access to. So obviously we have Facebook, we have Twitter, or X as it's supposed to be called now. How long we have that is a different question because of course it's moving to a different model, but that's sort of beside the point. Beyond that, we certainly don't have TikTok. It's not something that most government or government departments would allow on their devices, let alone use.
But we have Instagram. That's a question for you.
I don't know if the council has Instagram.
It does.
But if it does, I would I would rather hope that the comms team who manage most of these things would have used that as well. But certainly in terms of ensuring that we got students involved, we made direct contact through the comms team with the universities and the student unions. So we deliberately disseminated the message directly to student unions and to the universities to get the universities to push it down to students to ensure that they were aware. Now, as with all of these things, it's a bit, you can lead a horse to water, you can't make it drink. All we can do is tell people, this is how you vote, this is what you're going to need to do it. We're sorry that the list of approved pieces of ID doesn't include your student union card, for reasons beyond myself, certainly. That was a central choice that was made. But we did what we could to try and engage directly with those, and would continue to do so. I think we are open to using any and all social media, as I say, with possible exception of TikTok. And then I suppose coming finally to the question about whether election comms and particularly the voter ID stuff is a standing item for the comms plan. Up until this year, no, because obviously it wasn't an issue. It will be going forwards, albeit that whether we have to put the same amount of effort in next year, because we've already started to do some of that, and at least there should be some visibility. So the comms plan that we had built on the fact that the Electoral Commission did a national campaign. How many people saw it, I don't know, but the Electoral Commission did a national campaign and then subsequently did a targeted campaign for those areas that were having specific elections. And then we built our plan on the back of that. So there was sort of a three-phased approach here. And as I say, it's impossible to say with any absolute certainty how successful that was. I think what I can say is I would be confident that it was more successful as we did it than if we hadn't done it.
Okay.
If we just left it to the Electoral Commission, then things would not have worked as well.
Thank you for that, Bryn. As others have said, we know that there were more people. There's a whole cohort of people who were not captured in the turned away at the polling station. So we spoke to enough of them saying, "Well, no, I'm not. It's too much hassle. It's not something I'm prepared to engage with," and they didn't. And they didn't apply for the certification. But again, we're limited in the extent to which you can do anything about that, but it's something that I think members are certainly aware of. Thank you for the report. Thank you to members for your questions and comments. That concludes agenda item 7. Agenda item 8 is the work plan. We have our next meeting on the 27th of November, where we'll have hopefully two substantial items to discuss. We'll have an update on another of the council's major projects on this occasion, York Central, and then we'll have an agenda item on devolution, which I'm hoping will be discussion and our opportunity to input into governance and scrutiny arrangements for the new combined authority. Hopefully the timing of our discussion fits in with the timing of when that will be discussed by the joint devolution committee, but we are trying to be able to have some meaningful input before all the decisions are made and we're presented with a fait accompli. Councillor Eyre.
Thank you, Chair. It's just on the scrutiny work plan. Unfortunately, Councillor Myers has had to leave early, but we have got obviously the 18th of the 10th, the housing scrutiny was supposed to be looking at the recommissioning of the resettlement pathway and LD provision, which has disappeared off that particular scrutiny agenda, which is unfortunate given some of the issues around that have been discussed in the public and the media. Is that then coming to the 13th of the 11th, 23 housing scrutiny, or will there be no analysis of that particular, those papers?
Go on. I'm aware that there are active discussions, the chair and vice chair of health, housing and adult social care. I think it's fair to say we're sort of surprised and disappointed that those agenda items have been omitted from the published agenda for the meeting happening on Wednesday. and I know the chair and vice chair are in active discussions to to address that. And that's all I know at the moment.
Yeah, and I would have said much the same thing, actually, councillor Fenton. I think the only other thing I would say is my understanding is, yes, councillor Eyre. Well, that was my last understanding, that the item would stand referred to the next meeting.
Anybody would like to say anything about the work plan? No. Okay. There is no urgent business, so thank you very much for your participation and your patience. It's been a long meeting, but we've covered quite a bit